I invite you now to think of a time in your life when you believed something. You believed it with everything you had in you, and then you found out it wasn't true. Let me give you a couple of fun examples. One is my cousin. When we were growing up, she believed that chocolate milk came from brown cows. Can you imagine how she felt when she finally figured out that that was not where chocolate milk came from? And maybe some of you had a parent or an adult in your life and they told you that babies are delivered by storks. Can you imagine how somebody would feel when they found out where babies really come from? Might be a little bit embarrassing. So think of something fun. I'll give you one more example of something that people believe that isn't really true. Some believe that we only use about 30% of our brain, that there are all kinds of places in our brain that we could use, that we could put to work that we don't. But the truth is that we use all 2 pounds of it. All 100% of your brain is used. No doctor ever said, that tumor you have in your brain, it's in the perfect spot. It's in that place in your brain that you never use. That doesn't happen. We use it all. We just don't use it very well. So when we have a belief like that or a thought that's not true, when we get the evidence that it is not true, we have to be able to let go of it and embrace a new thought, to make room for something new, right? But we struggle to do that. A good example of that is germ theory. Scientists and doctors have been noticing the existence of something we now call germs, organisms of all kinds that are contagious or hurt our bodies. They were studying how illnesses were passed on to people, and they knew that there was something there that was carrying this disease to someone else, but they didn't know exactly what it was. In 1840-something, there was a Hungarian doctor that noticed 2 things. He noticed that a colleague of his had done an autopsy and accidentally cut himself, and he died, which made the doctor think there was something in that body. The deceased person had some kind of disease or bacteria that, of course, they didn't know it was bacteria then, that affected the other doctor. He also noticed that when women gave birth, if a midwife assisted in the birth, their babies did very well. But if a doctor delivered the baby, there was a high chance that the baby would get a fever and then die. So it makes sense, right, that there was something the doctor had on their hands that was being transferred to the baby. So this Hungarian doctor just asked everybody to please wash your hands between patients because something is being transmitted. But he was largely ignored. Nobody thought that was important to wash their hands. Of course, we all now know much better, don't we? But 20 years went by, and then a nurse named Florence Nightingale, you might have heard of her, also became an advocate of hand washing. She was working in a hospital, and it was so unsanitary. So many people were ill and becoming more ill instead of recovering. So she began to advocate for hand washing and for general sanitation, and it benefited her patients. But again, it didn't catch on with everyone, because no one could understand how we could live in a world with these little no-see-ums that were in our body, on our body, and being transferred between bodies. They couldn't understand how that could be. And so they resisted this hand washing until the early 1900s, when finally people began to wash their hands, especially the doctors, those in the medical community, wash their hands between patients, which benefits us all, right? Now, why do we resist that kind of change? I mean, what's wrong with washing your hands? It only takes 20 seconds, right? But they resisted that change. Now, let me give you one more as you think about that. In the time of Jesus, it was typically believed that the earth was the center of creation. The earth was the center of the solar system, and the sun and the moon went around the earth. We only had to look outside, right? And we could see that that was true. And then in the 17th century, we have Galileo, who says, no, I don't think so. I think the sun is at the center, and the earth is in orbit around the sun. Well, the Roman Church did not like that idea at all. They prosecuted Galileo for heresy. He called him a heretic, and they imprisoned him for the rest of his life. He served house arrest because the church said, the scriptures say very clearly that the earth, all of creation, is the center. And they used the Bible to prove their point. Now again, why so much resistance to an idea, a new thought? Why so closed-minded? There's an anthropologist named Genevieve Bell who suggests that when change comes too fast or too soon or it's too much, people go into a state she calls moral panic. And what that means is if a new thought, this new belief, challenges who we think we are, or our place in the world, or our place in God's creation, we go into this state of moral panic. We resist the change because it changes who we think we are. It changes our identity. Now, Bell generally studies technology because technology changes faster than culture. I mean, I'm just comfortable now with my cell phone and some of the cool things it can do, and it's already old, right? If you bought a cell phone today, it would be old tomorrow because technology is going so quickly. AI is a great example of this. Many of us are nervous about AI. What's going to happen? Are the robots going to take over? Are they going to do everything for humans and humans won't be needed anymore? That's the kind of change that Bell studies, and that's what she says causes moral panic when we're feeling like we don't know who we are anymore. We don't know what our place in the world is. Now, I've had a time like that in my life when the earth just kind of dropped out from under my feet, and maybe you have too. Maybe you've gone through a period in your life when you just didn't know which way was up. Everything you thought you believed wasn't true anymore. Nothing worked out the way you expected. Maybe you had a loss, maybe you suffered some kind of illness or an accident. Something changed everything for you. Now, when I look back on what I call the dark night of the soul, it was the most painful time of my life. But it was also the time that I grew the most, that I changed, and I had to become open-minded. I had to find a new normal. And that's what we all have to do when we're facing change like that. And that, I think, is exactly where our disciples are this morning in our reading. Now, what's so interesting about our reading, Evelyn shared with us from Luke, the very end of Luke's gospel, there is so little in that reading about the disciples, but I think they're the ones that we need to pay attention to. Jesus has all of the parts. He's got the speaking part, he does the teaching, he opens their minds, and then he floats away. But what is going on with our disciples? Now, if we look back just a little bit in Luke's gospel, we'll find out that according to Luke, in this section of scripture, we're still at Easter. No time has gone by. The 40 days that Jesus stays and teaches the disciples are not reflected in Luke's gospel. They're in Acts chapter 1, if you have the idea that Jesus taught the disciples and stayed with them for 40 days, that's where that comes from. But in Luke's gospel, there is no passage of time. So in just a few short days, the disciples have seen their teacher, their beloved Messiah, arrested and tortured and executed and put in a tomb. And just this very day, they find the tomb is empty. And then Jesus appears on the road to Emmaus talking to the other disciples. And then he shows up in the room with them. And then he has a fish dinner. And then, our reading today, Jesus is talking to the disciples and he opens their minds. There is no description here of how the disciples are feeling except 4 words from a little bit earlier in the chapter. They are terrified. They are amazed. They are joyful. They are doubting. Their emotions are all over the place. They're in flux. Their whole world has fallen apart inside of 4 or 5 days. And they don't know which end is up. They don't know what to do. They are in what Bell calls moral panic. Too much change, too soon. So what kinds of questions are the disciples wrestling with? What's happening in their minds? They've got to be thinking things like, if Jesus is the Messiah, how could he be dead? And if he's dead, how can he be right over there having fish with Thomas? We invested 3 years of our life. We left everything to follow him. And now, what do we do? What are we supposed to do? Do we just go back to fishing? Do we try to do something else? Were we mistaken? Were we all wrong? Are we hallucinating? Everything is mixed up for them. Life and death are overlapped because Jesus is supposed to be dead, and yet there he is. They are in a state of moral panic. And so Jesus spends time with them. He opens their minds, it says, shows them what the scripture means, interprets it maybe a little bit differently. And then he disappears. He floats away. Now, when I found out that Ascension Day was actually last Thursday and that this Sunday an optional reading was this one about Jesus' ascension, I was so intrigued because I've never studied it. I had never prepared a message on the ascension, and I wanted to understand it. And Jesus is not the only person historically or even mythologically who ascends and becomes a god. So that was an interesting point to find out. But when I read Christian peer-reviewed scholarly journals, I read 8. I read 8 of them. There is almost nothing about the ascension because nobody knows what to do with it. What do you do with a person who just floats up in the air and then they're gone? And Luke leaves it all to our imagination. He doesn't tell us much. We don't know exactly what's going on. Now, scholar David Cunningham says that there is a carving of some kind in a cathedral in Europe that's just the soles of somebody's 2 feet, and it's Jesus's feet as he ascends. So people were wondering about that. What happened exactly? Why is he gone? And I've even wondered about this picture in our sanctuary. Is Jesus standing on something or is he floating? Is he coming or is he going? Or is he hovering? What exactly is happening? If you have an idea, talk to me after church because I'd like to know what your take is on that picture. Because he looks to me like he's above everybody, but I don't know. So we are kind of excited about this idea. What does it mean that Jesus ascends? Now, the short answer is simple. It's the end of the book. It's the end of Luke's gospel. Jesus is gone, and there will be no more physical sightings of the resurrected Jesus. So don't report any, because he's not here. We saw him leave. End of the story. It's a wonderful end, because it doesn't leave any doors open. But Cunningham says there's more to it than that. He says when Jesus leaves, he makes room for everyone else. As long as Jesus is in the room, all eyes are on Jesus. We're all waiting to see what Jesus will do. But when he leaves, all eyes are on you. All eyes are on the disciples, the followers of Jesus, to see what they will do now. Will they just go back to their life? Will nothing have changed, or will they do what Jesus asked them to do? Will they do what they've been taught to do? Will they look around? Will they help one another? Will they share? Will they build a community that is just and righteous? Will they do the things that Jesus asked them to do? So Jesus leaving is the only thing Jesus can do, so that there's room for the church to arise. So all eyes are on the disciples. And I want to tell you this morning, and you may not know this, but all eyes are also on all of you. The Michigan Conference and the Presbytery are going to be watching, actually are watching our process already as we move towards something brand new. Bringing in another congregation, another denomination, with an interim pastor to come in and do church with us. It has not been done like this before. And I think they're actually calling me now from the conference. They want to set up some kind of interview so that all the churches in Michigan can see how we're doing this. How are we putting this partnership together? How are we going to make room for another church to come in? Now, you are lucky because you have a history of making room. You made room when you moved that house that was on this side of the church across the street on that side of the church. You made room when you built a gymnasium, when you built a whole community center attached to this building for your neighborhood. You made room when you dug out the basement so that Head Start could have a preschool down there. You made room when you went through the open and affirming process and you welcomed all into your family. So you're good at this. And that's why everybody is watching you, to see how this will go. Now, there are going to be times when a lot of change is coming fast, and we will be all feeling a little moral panic. Too much change too soon. How will you feel when the sign outside looks different? Because if we are truly going to be a partnering church with another congregation, they will also be on the sign. How will you feel when you walk in the doors of the parking lot and one door says St. John's UCC and the other door says Westminster Presbyterian Church? How will you feel if you walk in and somebody is sitting in your pew? You are going to want to say things like, whose church is this anyway? This is my church. I know where I am when I'm here. I know the history. My grandmother grew up here, and my parents grew up here, and I grew up here, and this is my church. And so my question is it? Is it your church? I mean, whose church is it? The disciples were wondering the same kinds of things. They knew what was going to happen. They knew they were going to be with Jesus, and Jesus was going to overthrow the Romans, and everything was going to be restored, and Israel was going to be amazing, and they were going to be right there, part of it. And now they're sitting in a room with something like a ghost who's teaching them and then floats off and disappears. What is happening? And we are going to be feeling some of the same, that loss of identity. What do? This isn't the old St. John's anymore. Everything is different. Jesus made room for the disciples. He spent time with them. He opened their minds. He unlocked the scriptures. He taught. And he let them know that there is a way forward. And it will be good in their minds. He spent time with them. He let them feel all the feelings. They were able to talk. And then at the very end, they are rejoicing in the temple. Because now they know who they are and they know where they're going, and it was nothing like what they expected. None of us know what to expect, do we? Life is always throwing curveballs at us. So let's do what the disciples did. Let's feel all the feelings. Let's feel terrified and annoyed and upset and joyful and doubting and wondering and curious. Let's stay in the room together. The disciples are still in that room. They almost never leave it at the end of these Gospels. They're always together because we need one another. We need support. We need to be able to share our feelings, talk to one another. And I'm not talking about those backdoor on the far side of the parking lot conversations when you say, I hate the minister, I can't believe they're doing this. Talk so we all know how you're feeling, so that we can let you let off some steam and let you find a new normal, a new peaceful way to be. Support one another. And when we're really feeling ouchy over all the change that's coming, and this, it's not just in church, it's change in general. Ask yourself, whose am I? Whose child am I? Latasha told me this morning, I'm a child of God. Who do I belong to? Whose church is this anyway? Anybody want to throw out an answer? Whose church is this? No one knows. Okay, that's your homework. This week, I want you to think long and hard. Whose church is this? Whose church is this? How will you answer that question? Amen.